In this video, I'm going to be upgrading the CPU on this mid-2010 17-inch MacBook Pro logic board. Now, before I start, I do want to mention that in most cases, an upgrade like this probably is not going to be worth doing on one of these boards, specifically at least. But the reason I'm going to be doing it in this video is because the CPU on this particular board is actually dead. Now, I figured since the CPU was dead, since I have to replace it anyway to make this board functional again, I figure why not just upgrade the CPU to the best one that I can use on the machine. So for that, I'm going to be using this board right here, which is a donor board, which has the highest end CPU that this platform supports, and that specifically is a Core i7-640M running at 2.8 GHz. Now, the original CPU on this particular board is a Core i7-620M, which is basically the same but runs at 2.66 GHz instead. Now, the base model of 15-inch and 17-inch MacBook Pro, the mid-2010 model at least, comes with a Core i5-520M, which is a 2.53 GHz Intel Core i5. Now, I will mention that all of these CPUs are dual-core. These are the first generation Intel Core i-series processors, aka Arendelle, and they only came in dual-core configurations, at least for the mobile platform. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and begin the process of removing our donor CPU. So I'm going to get this on the preheater, remove this, reball it, remove this CPU, clean the board, and solder this CPU once reballed onto this board. So it's just going to be basically a desolder of this one and a transfer from this board to this board. But it is quite a lot of work. As I mentioned, reballing is necessary in order to do this. So of course, to start out, we're just going to begin by removing our donor CPU from the 15-inch board. Alright, so I've gone ahead and gotten the donor board put on the board preheater and fully gotten it up to temperature. So the first thing we need to do before starting is just remove these 4 little pieces of adhesive on each corner of the chip. Alright, so now that all of those are removed, the next thing we need to do is just apply some flux to the chip. And now that the flux has been applied, we can go ahead and begin the process of desoldering the original CPU, or our donor CPU rather. So I'm just going to use a flashlight just to make sure everything is lined up. And that looks about good there, so we'll go ahead and turn on the hot air and begin desoldering the CPU. Okay, the CPU is now up to temperature and is ready to come off the board. I'm going to go ahead and move the hot air out of the way and pick it up. Alright, so now with the CPU off of the board, I'm going to go ahead and get the CPU prepared and ready to be reballed. Alright, so I've now gotten the donor chip in position and ready to begin the process of cleaning it off. So of course the first thing we need to do is remove all of the residual solder from the chip before we apply the new solder balls. So I'm going to go ahead and just use my soldering iron to do that with a bit of fresh leaded solder, and that should take all of the main pieces of solder off of the chip. So I'm just going to go ahead and wait for my iron to warm up a little bit here. And now we can go ahead and start the process. And it looks like we need a little bit more flux on there. Let's go ahead and add some. Alright, now with most of the main solder removed, we can go ahead and get all the solder off by using solder wick. Alright, so now that all of the residual solder has been removed, now we can just go ahead and clean the chip off using some rubbing alcohol and a paper towel, and then we will be ready to begin the process of reballing the chip. Alright, so I've now gotten the chip completely clean, as you can see right here. It is completely clean, no more flux on it. Got a stencil ready, and my little reballing jig here. So now what we're going to do is we're just going to go ahead and apply a tiny bit of flux to this chip, and then that way it will, all the balls, when they go through the holes, will stick to it and solder to it no problem. So I'm going to go ahead and get some flux applied, and then we can begin the process of reballing the chip. Alright, so now that we've gotten a very thin amount of flux applied to the chip, as you can see right there, we can now apply the stencil in the little jig here, and then begin the process of applying solder balls to the chip. So go ahead and get this lined up here. Alright, so now that the stencil is in position and fully lined up with each of the pads on the chip, we can go ahead and get our solder balls out and apply them appropriately. Now I want to mention I did ensure that there is no flux on the surface of the stencil. If there is any amount of flux on there, the solder balls will stick to it and will not go in their holes correctly. So you got to make sure that your stencil is perfectly clean before you do this. And then get the correct size solder balls. So in this case, they are 0.4 millimeters. So I'm just getting my 0.4 millimeter solder balls out here. And sometimes, depending on how the stencil looks, I will use slightly larger balls. So it actually looks like these might fit a little bit better with 0.45 millimeter balls. So I'm going to go ahead and try those first, and if they don't look correct, if they don't go through the holes properly, I'll go ahead and put the 0.4 on. I'm just going to try a couple here. And you just want to check them and make sure they look like they're going in the holes correctly. So let me just check with these here. Okay, and the 0.45s actually look really good on this stencil, so I'm just going to go ahead and use those. If you use a slightly larger ball, it'll actually make the soldering a little bit easier to do. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And once you get a good amount of balls on there, you can kind of just rock it back and forth and get them all in their positions. And most of the time you will not get them all in their positions, so once you get at least most of them in there, then you can just use a pair of tweezers to align the rest. Alright, so now all of the balls are in their holes respectively, so you can see that all of them are in there and there are no missing holes, and there are also no extra balls on top of the stencil. So if you have any extras on there, that will cause issues. So now we can go ahead and begin the process of heating the stencil up and getting all of the solder balls to seat in their holes. Okay, so now once you've gotten the balls mostly seated, we're going to want to go over it one more time with some extra flux and heat it again just to ensure all the balls are fully seated on their respective pads. So wait for it to cool down just a little bit here. And that's what you don't want to do. Alright, that'll probably be good. Alright, so that's looking pretty good now. So once that's ready, we can go ahead and let it cool down just a little bit, and then we can remove the stencil and see how it looks. So first want to check, make sure all the balls look to be seated appropriately. And it appears that's the case, so we can now go ahead and just remove the stencil. Alright, so now that the stencil has been removed, we're going to want to go ahead and heat it around all one more time and make sure we don't have any missing balls. And I already see one ball that's missing, which we'll replace manually here. But for now, let's just go ahead and heat it up and make sure all the balls are fully seated onto their pads. Alright, so now that chip looks really well done, so let's go ahead and take a close look at it here. We can see the reball job here. So as you can see, all the balls are in place, all the balls look perfectly uniform on the chip, And when you look at it and it looks perfect just like this, that's exactly how you want it to be. So now this chip is ready to be soldered onto the new board. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get the a target board, or the board we're trying to repair and upgrade, onto the board preheater, and then we'll begin the process of soldering this new CPU onto the board. Alright, so now with the board up to temperature, we can go ahead and just do the same exact process that we did with the original, or the donor board. So first, of course, we'll just remove the adhesive. Alright, and now that that's removed, we can go ahead and apply new flux, or some flux, to the perimeter of the chip. And now with that done, we can go ahead and start heating the chip and remove it from the board. Alright, the chip is now loose, so we can go ahead and remove it. Alright, so now that the chip has been successfully removed, we can go ahead and use the soldering iron to remove all of the residual solder. Alright, so now that most of the main solder is removed, we can go back over it with the solder wick and remove all of the residual. Alright, so that is all the residual solder fully removed from the board. So now I just need to clean off all the old flux using some rubbing alcohol on a paper towel, and then we'll be ready to install the new chip onto the board. Alright, so now we need to just apply some new flux to the pads on the board, and then we can go ahead and align the new chip and solder it on. So you don't want to put a whole ton of flux on the board, so we're just going to go ahead and wipe just a little bit off here, just to ensure there's a nice uniform coat on the board. So now we'll just go ahead and take our new chip and place it on. And now we'll just use a flashlight and a pair of tweezers to align it with the silkscreen outline. And once it's perfectly aligned, we can go ahead and solder the chip onto the board. Alright, so that looks to be pretty much perfectly aligned. So now we'll go ahead and take the hot air, place it over the chip, and start the process of soldering it on. Alright, so we got the hot air aligned on top of the chip. So now we can begin the process of soldering it onto the board. Alright, so that looks to be completely soldered now, so let's go ahead and turn the hot air off and let the chip cool down. Alrighty, so as you can see here, the CPU has been soldered on successfully. And if we go ahead and take a look at it from the very side here, we can kind of get a look at the solder balls under there. You can see that they are fully uniform and are fully seated to the board. You can see that the chip is perfectly even across the entire surface there, so there's no raised edges. If there were, it would not be soldered correctly. And it looks really good. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get everything cleaned up a little bit here, apply some fresh thermal paste to the CPU and GPU, install the heatsink, and we'll give it a test to see if it works. So I'm going to go ahead and do that and resume the video. Alrighty, so I have gotten the CPU heatsink reinstalled, and I've installed the board into this chassis. Now I do not have a battery connected because I don't have a spare 2010 17-inch board battery. So unfortunately, if it does work, it's not going to run at its full speed. But with that all said, let's just go ahead and plug the board in and see how it works. See if it turns on here. And yes, it does. It is on now. It's farther than it got before. Let's see if it posts successfully. And it does. The machine is now on and running. So let's go ahead and hold the option key down. I do have a solid state drive installed. We'll just go ahead and boot off that copy of El Capitan. Alright, and the machine has successfully booted. Let's just go ahead and log in. Alrighty, so let's just go ahead and check out about this Mac now that the system has fully booted. And there we go. You can see the 2.8 GHz Intel Core i7 CPU is detected. All 4 gigs of RAM I have installed is detected as well. And the GeForce GT 330M GPU is up and running perfectly as well. Let's just go ahead and check graphics displays out here. You can see it is detected. Now these 2010 boards, you have to reboot them a couple times for the Intel graphics to start working when there's no battery installed. But it should work just fine, and like I said, there's no battery installed in this system. So let's just go ahead and back into about this Mac one more time. We can take a look right here. And yeah, everything looks correct. The processor interconnect speed looks correct for this model. And everything is detected and working. Now I'm not going to do any performance testing with this system, just because, like I said, there's no battery installed, so it's going to run at like half speed. But I'd assume that the performance is at least marginally better than the original CPU, even though it wasn't that big of an upgrade. But as I mentioned, the main reason for upgrading the CPU in this was because the original CPU was dead and the machine would not boot at all with it installed. So that has been the successful upgrade from the Core i7 620M CPU to a Core i7 640M CPU, and the successful repair of this board, which had a bad CPU installed. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this video.